right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this inaugural Florida Climate Week presentation. I'm Josh Adams, and we're going to be presenting to you the Apalachee Regional Planning Council's Leadership in Coastal Resiliency, the Shoreline Habitats and Resilient Coasts, and Franklin98 projects. I'll give it just about another minute for folks to jump on, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start moving. I think that'll have given folks enough time to jump off their last presentation and on to the next one. So hi again, I'm Josh Adams. I'm joined here with Rick Harder with WSP. So I'll give a brief overview of the Apalachee Regional Council before I jump into the presentation. So just so everyone knows, the ARPC, or Apalachee Regional Planning Council, is we provide technical assistance to our member counties and local municipalities. Those are Calhoun, Franklin, Gadsden, Gulf, Jackson, Jefferson, Leon, Liberty, and Wakulla. And we help to provide technical and planning services to our membership counties and municipalities. Rick, would you introduce yourself before I introduce the two projects that we're going to be talking about today?
Sure, thanks, Josh. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my name's Rick Harder. I'm a coastal restoration specialist with WSP USA. We used to be called Ecology and Environment before joining WSP. I sit in the Tallahassee office here, and I'm glad to be here with you today.
Thank you, Rick. So so what we're going to be talking about today is the Franklin98 project and the Shoreline Shoreline Habitats and Resilient Coast projects. So one led into the other. So that SHaRC project basically informed us about areas in our region along the coastline that would be receptive to different sort of restoration projects. So at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to understand everything we're doing as far as coastal resiliency, the benefits of improved estuarine habitats, and some of the analysis that went into this project and the expected benefits of the Highway 98 project itself. So estuarine habitats provide protection, and this is nothing new or novel, and we have various success stories from around the state. This is actually a photo from Project Green Shores over in Pensacola. Now we're expecting our Franklin98 project to see similar benefits as this one that has been completed already, but with a few different flavors. And we'll be touching on those a little bit later. But as you can see in the photo along the right, kind of the top right edge of the photograph, there's a breakwater, and behind it are various marsh grasses. And that's what we're expecting to achieve with our Franklin98 project. So here's a spectrum of solutions for shoreline habitat. Keep this in mind because we're going to be visiting it later when we discuss the Franklin98 project. So on the far left, we see vegetation only, and on the far right, those are more of our hard armoring or gray infrastructure that we'll see. And so we want to focus in on kind of those middle to the sills and breakwaters because that's what we have proposed for our designs for the Franklin98 project. And there's kind of leeway from the vegetation only to the gray infrastructure. But out of our analyses and community meetings, we've decided to go with the breakwater and sill option for our shoreline. So that's a background of kind of both those projects. And now I'm going to dive into that shoreline habitats and resilient coasts for Apalachicola Bay that I briefly mentioned and what informed our Franklin98 project. So the purpose of the SHaRC analysis was to identify areas and prioritize those for coastal restoration. We looked at wave climate and bathymetry. We looked at public ownership, nearby access for ease of feasibility and public benefit. I also looked at larger projects and segments that are grouped together rather than fragmented ones, because those are more cost effective. And the protection of public lands and infrastructure could also reduce some of those future costs. So with all these in mind, we ultimately looked at sites, or what kind of rose to the top that we'll see a little bit later when Rick speaks, is that sites with easy access, shallow bathymetry, and limited modification are the best sort of projects suitable for this type of restoration. So here's a little infographic of the various layers that went into the analysis. So it was a geographic information systems, or a GIS analysis, where we fed into the GIS model existing data to reduce project costs and to help increase delivery time of the project. Infrastructure erosion, projected erosion, ownership, public access, current habitat, fetch, length of shoreline, and nearshore bathymetry were the data sets that went into that. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick. He's going to touch a little bit more on each of those data sets, and then ultimately the sort of conclusions that we were able to draw from it.
Okay, thanks, Josh. So essentially, to look at all of the shorelines around Apalachicola Bay, there's 274 miles that we looked at. We broke it into 30-meter segments, and then scored each of those segments of shoreline based on a number of different factors. So most of it was proximity analysis. So we would compare a section of shoreline, and if it was very close to a roadway, for example, it would score more highly than a segment of shoreline that's not close to a roadway. And same thing with building footprints, critical facilities, which includes things like police stations, fire stations, hospitals, that sort of thing, septic tanks, all sorts of different key infrastructure, also archaeological features with the aim to protect those. We also looked at social aspects as in terms of public use. How easy was it for people to access particular segments of shoreline, with the idea that the more accessible they are, the greater the return on investment if we are, spending money to restore those shorelines. And then we also looked at things like feasibility and constructability and other things that focus on the water depths and things like that. Next slide, please. So with each of those different data sets, we were able to look at them individually, such as this one, where we're looking strictly at proximity to existing marsh habitat. We're also able to group them together in different themes, which I'll show you in a minute. And then we had a composite analysis where we factored in all of the different things, the constructability and the return on investment and resiliency and all those types of things. Okay, so let's look at this slide a little closer. The areas you see that are red are segments of shoreline that are relatively far from existing marsh. The black segments of shoreline, there's already marsh present, or at least within 250 meters. And so let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so here's one looking strictly at roads. Again, this is if a road or if a shoreline segment is within 20 meters, 20 meters is very close, of a roadway, it shows up as blue. And you can see there's a significant amount of shoreline where that is the case, particularly where Highway 98 travels right along the shoreline. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so then if we group some of those single factors together, we can say, okay, well, ecological resiliency, not just marsh, but other factors as well. And so then we start to get some additional scoring going on here. So again, you see these blue areas of shoreline are the higher priority areas where there's the greatest need for habitat enhancement. Okay, next slide, please. And then community resiliency really focuses on the protection of human infrastructure. Again, this is the schools and the building footprints and the roadways and the critical facilities and things like that. And again, you see certain segments of shoreline have more than others. It's kind of spotty in some places. And so I think the next one is our composite. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is where we combined all the different factors together to really try and isolate exactly which segments of shoreline would give the greatest benefit, the greatest return on investment, which areas made the most sense. Particularly recognizing that there are literally billions of dollars going towards restoration in the Gulf of Mexico from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. There's a lot of resiliency funding out there after numerous hurricanes and just ongoing trends in funding. And so what you see here is these areas that are blue and purple really score the highest. And I'm going to, with the next slide, we'll sort of zoom in on one particular area that consistently scored highly. We knew it's a priority area. This really just validated it. And that is the area between the East Point breakwater, which is down to the lower left. It's two green straight lines, and then the very top right, just to the northeast of this rectangle with the black dashed lines. And so this is an area that we, WSP and Apalachee Regional Planning Council sort of took the next step and identified some potential funding sources to help develop that into a restoration project. So I think this is where I turn it over to you,
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So yeah, just for a moment again, look at this focus area, because we're going to be, well, I'm going to touch back on it. But notice that it's really red, that high priority area. So we thought to ourselves, like, this is going to be really great. It captures a lot of different segments, and it's about a 12-mile stretch of shoreline too. So it kind of has that critical mass that we were looking for to get a really good, I guess, return on investment by focusing in on this part of the shoreline. So if the SHaRC analysis told us that this area would be receptive from a modeling standpoint, we then went on to this Franklin98 project that we're going to introduce you now. So the first phase was the planning element, where we conducted a series of different stakeholder outreach sessions. And then we're now into phases 2 and 3, which is funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Phase 1 was funded by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. So this is the phases 2 and 3 takes us through data collection, construction, and monitoring. And we're really excited to share the project with you. So these are some representative photos from the south-facing right-of-way along Coastal Highway 98. We see a bunch of different hard armoring, or those gray infrastructure types. That would be the far right side of the graphic that was shown earlier. We see riprap, some old timber, seawalls, some corrugated concrete in the bottom left hand of the picture, and then also is your standard concrete seawall that actually traverses a good section of the project. But what we don't see here is a lot of green infrastructure that may be precluded by the implementation of these more gray types of infrastructure. So Here's a picture of a pier at Gramercy Plantation. The top is prior to Hurricane Michael, and the bottom picture is after Hurricane Michael. So we noticed that kind of in addition to our SHaRC analysis, and from also success stories from around the nation, including that project, Green Shores, we have some empirical evidence along the stretch of Highway 98 that under the right conditions, a fringing marsh, so this little bit of spartina there that you see, as well as that sediment accumulation, would in fact be feasible along the section of roadway. So seeing this, being encouraged by the outputs in the SHaRC analysis, really gave us the insight into the next steps for our project. Now, that pier is really kind of critical in the development and of the marsh and sediment, because it allowed for enough wave attenuation. So it broke down and absorbed some of the waves that were coming in and hitting the shoreline enough so that this patch of spartina was able to establish itself and begin to start growing. So again, here's another picture of the Gramercy Pier. So this is after Hurricane Michael. You can see that the right-of-way is pretty severely eroded. The corrugated concrete is exposed where there was soil and grass there. And yeah, we might have lost some of that sediment and marsh, but the big picture thing to keep in mind here is that that's still remaining after a very large hurricane. So Hurricane Michael was upgraded to a Category 5 afterwards. So this really highlights that the marsh and buildup and sediment can still, in fact, be present after a very large storm event. So with the SHaRC analysis in mind, some of this empirical evidence that we have of the shoreline, we began to seek potential project partners. And it was really critical for us to establish what we were doing up front and get some of this community buy-in. So we targeted Franklin County Board of County Commissioners, leadership there, us as the Regional Planning Council. We've been in touch with the Florida Department of Transportation, and they're supportive of the project, different property owners along the way, seafood industry groups, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, Fish and Wildlife, the FDAC, so agriculture and looking at fisheries, the Water Management District, the Federal Wildlife Service, NOAA, and also kind of attached to NOAA and FDAP, the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. Two of our research universities in town, FAMU and FSU, as well as some NGOs and Conservation Corps, an arm of AmeriCorps. We engaged all these organizations early on and were able to receive letters of support that really solidified our capacity building. So we made sure that we hit on all these different partners before beginning the larger study. So again, the top right picture is the project area that's bounded in the red box. And so we introduced the concept of the SHaRC model. We had a series of, I believe, 12 different outreach events, might have been more than that, but we had dedicated public events as well as kind of internal, kind of like FDEP, Florida Fish and Wildlife. So we had both public outreach as well as kind of our internal, what we call them interagency from the regulatory side, to be able to understand some of the parameters that we might have to work under if we were to go ahead and continue on to the next phases. So we're talking about phase 1 right now, which is the outreach conducted under FDEP. A lot of what we did consisted of presentations and feedback. And so that bottom middle picture that you see there is an example of one of our desktop table exercises. So we printed out a large map of the project area. We asked for for feedback that I'll explain a little bit more in a few slides. But really, we're trying to do a big information sharing. So what we learn from SHaRC, as well as information gathering from the community. We also, WSP was able to produce some very preliminary different models, like the one on the bottom right is just a wave run up to kind of give us an idea of the physical conditions that we might experience under tropical storms or hurricanes, for instance, and some of those considerations, design considerations that we would need to address up front and kind of bring to the public. And as Rick mentioned, as a result of the SHaRC analysis, we focused in on the area bounded by the red box with East Point all the way on the west side. That might be a little bit confusing, but East Point is on the west side of the box, and Carabel Beach is on the very far right side of the box. So this is our about 12-mile focus area and project area. And so that feedback that we were able to get from our various desktop or tabletop exercises and breakout groups, we really kind of boiled down the information generated from that into 3 distinct categories: general interest, kind of caution areas, and then background information that we then mapped out. So this feedback really has helped to influence our design and considerations that we have about 30% design. We're still doing a full design, and this type of feedback has been paramount to helping us understand what the community wants and needs and what it doesn't want. And so the biggest takeaways, I think, from those exercises were erosional hotspots. So we were able to really dial in on those areas that have the most critical damage and quite often repetitive damages. So we see that a few distinct areas suffer a lot, and from different types of events, some weaker, some stronger. Then there's some design considerations for other species, such as shorebirds. Shorebirds, loafing shorebirds, don't really like a lot of vegetation. They like a real flat, wide open space. So we had good input from some of our NGOs there. And then also from the residents themselves, while they were very receptive of the project, they also wanted us to keep in mind some of the historic uses. So for instance, if there is a sandy piece of shoreline where folks build sand castles, they would want to be able to keep doing that there. Also, fishing is really popular along the right-of-way. So in designing both the marsh and reef areas, we're very acute to leaving some access areas open for cast netting, gigging, and traditional fishing that take place along this 12-mile stretch of shoreline. So I've talked a lot about Franklin-98. So let's get down a little bit more into what exactly our specific goals are. So we want to see increased ecosystem productivity and diversity. We want to see shoreline stabilization, community resiliency, community education and cooperation, as well as economic development. And we believe that we achieve all of that with this looking into restoring and creating a section of reef and marsh. So on the bottom right, that left-sided picture with the reef and the straight line is quite often what restoration projects traditionally are. Well, we're also really shooting for a innovative, more natural looking reef layout and design. So it looks really amorphous, the same way that that natural oyster reefs look like. So that if we could have a, the best project would resemble something more on the right side of the screen there, and having all the different footprint allows a greater diversity of habitat types that really, again, achieve those goals and visions to the left there with the ecological productivity, resiliency, and some of the economic development there. So the status of the project today, what is it? We're in mid-April. Well, this project started back in 2019 under phase 1 with the FDEP grant that included the stakeholder outreach. And so that's been completed. The last about a year or half a year, we've been working under phase 2, really getting out, collecting our benchmark data, running transects, doing our various species surveys, establishing monitoring parameters up front, and some of the construction will be done under the Emergency Coastal Resiliency Fund through NIFWIF. And then phase 3 is going to continue that construction and monitoring under the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, also through NIFWIF there. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick so he can kind of get down into the data collection and analysis that's taken place to date, some of the next steps, and then get into some of the more, for me, exciting stuff, which is some of the reef and marsh design.
Great, thanks, Josh. So as Josh mentioned, we've been busy collecting lots of data to help us with the design. That's included a lot of elevation data, running sonar surveys from boats, as well as we've already flown multiple LiDAR flights. That's where they fly in an airplane and use a laser to capture the elevations of the ground. And we have been using high resolution aerial imagery to help us map the seagrass beds, which we want to be sure to avoid with our design. And you'll see more of that shortly. I've been doing threatened and endangered species surveys to make sure that that we're not impacting any listed species. And we've also been collecting some information about the wave conditions and the water levels and currents and so on with different types of equipment. And then finally collecting sediment samples throughout the project area to make sure that the conditions are going to be appropriate for our design. Next slide, please. Starting in phase 1, we did put some test materials out to better understand what we might decide to use for our reef materials. One of those materials is it's a vegetative fiber that's soaked in cement and then shaped into different shapes. There's a company called Sandbar Oyster Company out of North Carolina that came up with this. They call their materials oyster catcher materials. You can see here, this is some of our test materials with oysters on a lot of them. They're not capturing quite the rate of colonization that we would really love to see, but we are pretty happy with what we're seeing. It's helping us to inform our design and realizing that predation is really key, and providing some refuge for the juvenile oysters is going to be an important part of our design in terms of what materials we choose to use and how we construct those. Next slide, please. Here are some of those oyster catcher materials that we have been looking at. They're different colors simply because the ones in the middle had just been put out that day that the photo was taken. Now they're all gray, and all of them have lots and lots of oysters on them. But it was just a chance to test out some of the materials, really looking at the stability of the materials and how well they colonize. Next, please. We've also been looking at the natural oyster colonies in the area. These are some rocks that are present within the project area, down in what we call the intertidal zone. That's the zone between the low tide line and the high tide line. So whatever's in this area gets wet part of the day, and then it's exposed to the air part of the day. We're looking at how many oysters do you get per square foot, for example, and how big are they, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about the design as we have planned it out right now, our preliminary design. Some of the really important design considerations that are really driving what we're doing. Seagrass coverage is a big one. There's a lot of really valuable seagrass within our project area, and we want to make sure that we don't have any negative impacts on those seagrass beds. So we're working around them. We're also putting a 15-foot buffer around each of them where we're not going to construct anything. We're looking at the wave climate to make sure that whatever materials we're putting in are going to be able to tolerate the normal wave climate. And also that the materials we put in create the right kind of wave climate for the marshes, just like Josh had pointed out with the pier and how there was some marsh that had become established behind it. Bathymetry just means the water depths. That drives a lot of what we do. Of course, there are regulatory considerations associated with permitting and avoiding impacts to, for example, the Gulf sturgeon. Stakeholder input is really important to us. If property owners really want to see a certain look or not see anything at all, we can take that into consideration. And then, really what we talked about a lot with the SHaRC analysis really highlights what we're after with the coastal infrastructure. Where can we protect the roadway and other infrastructure? So next slide, please. Along the roadway, there are some areas where there's really seems to be a particular focus of the erosion that has occurred after each of the major storms. And these drainage outfalls are one of those key areas. There's a lot of them along the project area. In some cases like this, it's sort of indented into the shoreline. So it allows the waves to sort of build up before they crash against that vertical wall. And so it's really important that these get some added protection. Conversely, these drainage outfalls actually make for favorable conditions for the marsh and the oysters. They provide greater range of salinity, which helps with the oysters. And also they bring in fine sediments that both can serve as a food source for the oysters, but also helps the marsh develop. And the oysters and the marsh themselves can help clean up this water and provide for greater water quality within the bay as well. This map here shows you those outfalls. Each of the red dots is a drainage outfall. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. And we've highlighted a number of them where you have really obvious damage after each, or this is after Hurricane Michael. If you can see on the road asphalt, those dark rectangles, those are areas where the roadway had to be patched up after Hurricane Michael. And in every case, it's right where the outfall was. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the design that we have in mind. As you can see here, and this is an aerial photograph that is fairly representative of the project area. There are dark areas out in the water. Those are the submerged seagrass beds that we're working to avoid. Close to shore between the high tide and low tide lines that's the intertidal zone. And then there's those bare patches out in the water where it's always underwater but doesn't have seagrass. So maybe that's somewhere where we can build some oyster reefs. Okay, so next slide, please. For the intertidal area, that's where we're really looking to establish as much marsh as possible. We're going to be using native salt tolerant species. The one you see here in the photograph is the most common one. This will be the primary species used for the project. It's called smooth cordgrass or Spartina alterniflora. But we will have some other species in there for added diversity. And our goal is to get the marsh established as quickly as possible. Next, please. Now, for the edge of the marsh, we want to provide some protection. So we're going to create what's called a sill. It's basically a really narrow fringe of reef. So we'll have a sill along many of the marsh areas. Again, it provides protection, but really it serves as important habitat as well. Next slide, please. And so some of the materials that we're looking at using for the marsh sill, I mentioned the oyster catcher materials that can be shaped into all sorts of different configurations. And so we're looking at a lot of that type of material. One of the benefits we're seeing from that material is it provides a lot of small spaces where the oysters can become established while being protected from predators. We're also looking at using traditional rocks or recycled concrete that's broken up to look like rock. So, think of like an old sidewalk that gets removed, and those slabs of concrete can be busted up essentially into the same size and material as any limestone rock that you would buy. Okay, next slide, please. Now we're also looking at using some other materials in the deeper water, and by deeper, I'm thinking like 1 to 3 foot deep water. We're looking at reef balls. You can see some pictures here. The lower left picture shows you one that's on the left has got lots of oysters on it already, and on the right is what it looks like before it goes in the water. We showed you the tabletops. That's the bottom right. You can basically a 4-legged table that you jet down into the sediment. It's about 2 feet across by 2 feet across, square, and then you can stack them just like this. And that space between the two of them gives you that refuge for the oysters to get established and grown up big enough that they're less vulnerable to being eaten by predators. And then at the top, you've got the riprap and recycled concrete. Okay, next slide, please. So where are we now and where are we going? So we've got our preliminary design. We're calling it 30% design. We continue to do extensive stakeholder outreach, both our interagency meetings as well as public meetings. Tonight, we've got one specifically focused on landowners within the area. There are several hundred property owners over the 12-mile study area. And we're working to engage each and every one of them if possible to make sure that we consider any input that they have and to also get their support. And we've been coordinating extensively with others on research. There's the Apalachicola Bay Systems Initiative that is also funded by NIFWIF. And there's a number of other research activities and restoration activities underway. So we're going to continue coordinating with others. And, we hope that you will follow the project. There is a Facebook page. Let us know if you're ever in the East Point or Carabel area, Apalachicola area. We'd be happy to meet with your group and give you a tour, or if you want a virtual presentation, we can do that. So I think at this point I turn it back to you, Josh.
Hey, yeah, thank you for that, Rick. So this slide and then the next slide are really show what might be accomplished by our project should it become very successful. We would love for the shoreline to be full of marsh, like Rick mentioned, the Spartina alterna Florida, maybe some Juncus or Marianus on the upper ends where it's not as shallow. But so we would be absolutely thrilled. We would consider the project to be hit out of the park if it looks like this after a few years. This next slide, I've got kind of similarly a still photograph with how it is now on the left with the exposed riprap and essentially kind of bare muddy areas from all the siltation, runoff, and erosion there. And what we're thinking it would look like after a few years of growth with the plants as well as the invertebrates. So that concludes our overview of the Franklin98 project. So hopefully we've described it to y'all well enough to where you kind of understand the background, how we were able to select this segment of shoreline for coastal restoration through that SHaRC, that Shoreline Habitat and Resilient Coast project. And then the phases 1, 2, and 3, phase 1 being that really that outreach driven approach, the collaborations that we built, and then onto those second and third phases that are ultimately going to see construction of the project. And since it is Florida Climate Week, and we're talking about really exciting things going on around the state, I wanted to just really briefly introduce the Apalachee Resilience Collaborative that we've been working to establish the last, really just the last few months. The Resilience Collaborative, the ARPC established a memorandum of understanding back in November of 2020 that establishes a framework for our counties and municipalities to sign and be a part of the collaborative. So to date, I believe we've had 7 of our 9 county commissions approve them unanimously. We didn't have a single commissioner who was not supportive of this initiative. So kind of the 3 big things, and it's still in its incipient stages, and not sure exactly what we'll be working on, but we do know kind of these big 3 things here is any of the initiatives proposed under the Resiliency Collaborative are not going to be binding. So they're meant to guide rather than impose harsh restrictions on development. Our elected officials were pretty adamant that they like where it's going, but some of the areas that might not be able to implement them, they didn't want to see penalties for not being able to achieve any of the goals that might come out of it. So the initiatives as a part of the collaborative are member driven. So they're all going to be ideas that come out of our region. And so we're going to be really looking for good feedback from our cities and municipalities on exactly what they would like to see. And so from that, we hope to develop an action plan. So this plan will establish different goals and objectives over the next few years to for us to be able to point to them and say, this is what our region really wants and needs. And hopefully we're able to, again, kind of point to that plan and draw down funding as it becomes available. Have just a really preliminary structure of the collaborative right now. You can imagine it as a triangle, and at the top of that, I've got a picture on the next slide showing this executive steering committee at the top of that, which is comprised of the ARPC executive committee members. So they're going to be the resilience leadership there, working group comprised of higher level county and city staffers, elected officials, county administrators and coordinators, as well as planning and engineering departments. And then also we would love to engage and have private partners be able to participate, give us an idea of any industry trends that are going on, some of the more progressive things that are happening around the nation or globally really that are helping to make communities more resilient. So we're hoping to get out ahead of disasters and have a good return on investment for anything that we're working on. So I mentioned the kind of the little infographic here that just kind of outlays the structure of the Resilience Collaborative. And then finally, just kind of the benefits or why join. So we're wanting to see that return on investments in communities. So how can we do things up front that are going to pay off in the future? By identifying our region's resiliency deficits, we're able to map out goals and set specific policies to meet those. So we're really expecting this to serve as a centralized forum for resilience-related initiatives in the region. identify common resiliency needs so that we can pursue grants and reduce duplicity of efforts across the region. And so we're seeing a lot of support from state leadership, both Governor DeSantis, House Speaker Sprouse, and Senate President Simpson are all supportive of these resiliency collaboratives, and even so much as to begin to fund them. So we're really trying to stand this up and get the framework in place ahead of those funding opportunities so that we're able to come out and meet them head on. So I'd like to thank everyone who's listened into this presentation. We know it's not as good as if it were in person, but thank you everyone for listening and being a part. And if we have a few questions, we would love to be able to take those. I'm trying to pull up my screen here. See if I can. Rick, are you able to see the chat box? Do we have any messages that have come up? You're muted, Rick.
No, yeah, it says no questions at this time.
Okay.
But just, yeah, again, if everybody, our websites, arpc.org and wsp.com, and those are our email addresses there. We'd love for you to check out the Facebook page for Franklin98. And yeah, look forward to any questions anybody might have after the fact, if you think of something that comes up after today.
Yeah, we'll be checking the app and eager to answer any questions. I already have a call scheduled for Friday, I believe, to talk about some of this. So, and many thanks to the Volo Foundation for setting this up and making this possible. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, indeed.
All right, with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everybody.